My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we're putting all our eggs in one casket as we go cross-country with the Chained Coffin.
Our first segment is the basic crawl. The Chained Coffin is a 22-page adventure designed for a party of level 5 characters in the Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG. The writer is Michael Curtis. The cover art and cartography is by Doug Kovacs. The editor is Dak Ultimak. Interior art by Doug Kovacs. Stefan Poag, Mike Wilson. Art direction and layout by Joseph Goodman. Now, I'll note here that there's a whole lot of material in the Chained Coffin box set, which is now available in a compendium PDF. We're only looking at the Chained Coffin adventure itself in this episode, about the 30 pages or so that is that adventure. The text starts with an introduction and background. The TLDR version is that there's a good cleric from long ago trapped in a magic coffin, and the Chaos Champion who trapped him there is awaiting the celestial alignment that will let him unleash the forces of evil on the world, or at least the Shutter Mountains. Next comes the Hidden Cave, where the player characters discover the tomb of Zugun and his chained coffin, which is guarded by giant skeletons, one a minotaur, the other a human-snake hybrid. Zugun explains the predicament he's in and sets up the premise of the scenario. Drag this coffin across country to the Lusal Wheel, wherever that is, to stop the villain's ritual. You have 7 days to get it done.
The next section then is the journey to the mountains, and this actually begins with some background material on the setting, including the Shud folk, which is a brief overview of the local people who inhabit the Shudder Mountains region, and a write-up of Bent Pine, a small trading outpost that can serve as the PC's base of operations to a degree, as they explore the district and try to figure out where this wheel is. It also includes Event 1, Music in the Mountains, where a local inhabitant performs a folk song that contains some hints about the Lusal Wheel. The rumour table is in this section as well. Next up is the section entitled The Shudder Mountains. This includes random encounters, the Deep Hollows, Event 2, Wind in the Night, in which a terrible monster is foreshadowed, and a whole bunch of places to explore, which are Shudfolk Farm, the Fiddler's Grave, a ruined mill, the Crossroads, Granny Holder's Place, the Biggintees Farm, agricultural hill giants, Squire Grady's Cabin, a haunted hut, the Backdoor Trail, which is one way to get to the wheel, in fact, the home of the Sin Eater, and Bad Lick Bridge, which is the more obvious and dangerous way to get to the Lusal Wheel. There's also a good sidebar near the crossroads on the Selling of Souls. The next and final major section is the Lusal Wheel. This is the final set of locations for the adventure, and those places include the Forgotten Back Door, which you need to do a bit of extra work to find, the Grand Entrance featuring the adventure's signature puzzle wheel gimmick thing, which is a kind of series of concentric circles that you can cut out and form into a physical prop to play with at the table. Inside either of those entrances is the Star Chamber, a troll lair, the Ancient Storeroom, and the Lusal Wheel itself. And it's here that we have Event 3, the Confrontation, which also includes a bit of a helping hand from an event called Justicia's Empowerment, in which one of the PCs gets made really giant, Power Rangers style. Then we have Ending the Adventure and a set of handouts and maps and the usual things that you would expect.
So let's establish our bona fides here. I've only read this adventure. Tom, how about you?
So I played in this as the culmination of a short DCC campaign that was set in the Shudder Mountains. So we had 5... Oh, wait, must have been more than that, because we had a funnel at the start. So, yeah, 6 scenarios going up in level each time, because you're meant to be level 5 by the time you get to this. By the way, that is the highest level I've ever got a PC to in DCC. It just doesn't happen normally. And then, so the Chained Coffin itself, that was 3 or 4 sessions, I think. But because I was a player, I'm a little hazy as to exactly where the Chained Coffin started and the previous thing ended. But it was around about that, I would say. And that was a party of 4 of us, I want to say. 4 or 5, depending on who was available.
Nice. So things we liked about the Chained Coffin, I'll start out by saying that the art and layout as with many of the newer DCC modules, is fantastic, and for all the reasons that we've talked about before when we've discussed DCC modules, like the Croaking Fane or the Sailors of the Starless Sea. There's that beautiful old school art style. Every part of the page is used in the layout. Lots of little fun things tucked here and there. The maps are fabulous. Visually, you just can't go wrong with DCC.
Yeah, it's terrific. I mean, I didn't even put a note about this in my prep because it's like, you sort of do them a disservice because you get so used to DCC books looking like this. But of course they're so good. There's a real energy to the art and the layout, actually. The way they use the space, the way they sort of break the grid all the time, and it draws you in, and I mean, it really enhances the adventure as well. Even just being, shown a picture of the bridge. It's just an empty bridge with holes in it when you see it, but it still looks enticing and kind of dangerous, which is, it's just great.
Something else I liked about the module, so we should say, I don't know if we made it super obvious in the basic crawl, but the Shutter Mountains setting is a sort of fantasy Appalachia, meaning a sort of fantasy version of the part of the United States that is around the Great Smoky Mountains, West Virginia, parts of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Tennessee, that kind of thing. I felt like it was pretty well researched, I think. I'm not super conversant in Appalachian folklore and things like that, but as best I could tell, it seemed reasonably well researched. I've been doing a fair amount of reading myself lately, the last 14 months to be exact, about folk magic and folk healing, and I recognized a lot of things in the module from my readings. So this idea of there being power at the crossroads, that's something that comes up a couple times in the adventure. The physical presence of the devil, like a literal physical personification of the devil. That's something we talked about before when we were discussing Times That Fry. That's a thing in American folklore. References to conjuremen and hants and hollows and all that kind of thing. Cryptids, this idea of cryptid monsters, the geographical characteristics of Appalachia. It all felt pretty good. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Appalachia, but what do you think about that, Tom?
Well, yeah, well, I mean, I'm not really. I roughly know its geography. I'm mostly familiar with it through, the music, because, of course, if you have any connection to jazz or blues and those sort of European folk music, then you're always hearing from folk musicians from this region as well. Bluegrass, of course, is from part of Appalachia.
Right.
But certainly, the recurring motifs that feature in the folk music definitely show up here. And I think that the Goodman Games crew decided, they sort of repeat quite a lot that it's a different fantasy world, and that, they quite deliberately set up different gods and mythological structures, and kind of they keep mentioning that you're meant to sort of be dressed like normal fantasy characters.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that in part they do that to avoid having to be that careful, so they can get away with just it being thematically Appalachian rather than historically.
Right.
But I don't think that didn't really stick for us, because I mean, it's the analogues are so obvious, and I think we'll talk about this a bit later, that we were constantly forgetting to talk about Justitia and just started talking about Jesus and the devil and things, and it didn't really matter. And I don't think anyone's mind's eye was picturing barbarians in cloaks walking around.
Right,
It was just,
right.
But it still works really well. I've seen people kind of complain about the Shutter Mountains setting, kind of going, does it make sense that this would be, they'd have mining communities in the
Right,
mountains
yeah.
in America, but they'd also have crossbows? But here's the secret to make it work. You don't think about it very much.
This is one of my questions, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So in that sense, in that folkloric sense, that's what holds it all together really well. And these communities in the really rugged forested mountains, that all comes across great. And it feels very American. I don't know the region specifically, but it felt to me like it was a whole, apart from certain matters which we'll cover in the questions, it felt like it was a unified clump of Americanness.
Yeah. I think that the module does a pretty good job of avoiding many of the kind of cruel, easy jokes about Appalachia that are a sort of feature of American pop culture. But I think only just because the Big and T's and Grandma Hulda are certainly getting into the kind of crude hillbilly stereotypes. But I think the authors just get away with it because those characters are sort of monstrous outsiders as compared to the rest of the Shud folk, which are the sort of people of this region in the Shudder Mountains. I do wonder how the rest of the setting material is in that regard. I've only read this part of it. Have you read any more of it?
Some bits of it since playing in the kind of short campaign. It seems, yeah, I don't want to kind of give a comprehensive thumbs up or down, but it seems about right okay, although I did notice in the intro to this, it mentions going to the superstition-ridden Shadow Mountains, and I'm like, the devil is literally walking around. I don't think it counts as superstition at that point. It feels like the authors have written this because they really like the setting they're trying to portray, the general inhabitants of the place. So I think that goes a long way. You're right, though, that the Big Inti farm, honestly, from my position outside the culture, I can't really comment how much of that is a negative stereotype and how much of that is just the way you portray people from, like, within it as well. Like, is that your opinion of your bad neighbours? So I don't...
Yeah.
But I know what you mean. It seems a little borderline, but hey, it's generally, I got a feeling it's done from a position of love in general, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, that was my overall impression too. I mean, like, one thing that I think the module clearly has is a sort of basic appreciation of how beautiful that part of the United States is. I like this particular description. Innumerable creeks wind their way through the deciduous and coniferous forests that grow in the valleys, and the whole region is a contrast of heartbreaking beauty and sinister gloom. That is very much my opinion of the Great Smoky Mountains, at least. I've been there a few times, and it does have that feeling. It's incredibly beautiful, but there's also this sadness to it in the air, sort of. Like, maybe it's just because of the environment, because of the fog that is, like, quite prominent. There's a lot of, like, historical, cultural things going on in that part of the country as well. It's one of the more impoverished parts of the country, and you can see signs of that, but it's still, like, incredibly beautiful. And so it's an interesting part of the country, and you don't even have to be there very long before you realize that it's a place that is suffused with, like, folk legends and folk healing and that sort of blending of, like, Christianity and, like, other, like, sort of spiritual practices, right? Like, that all kind of comes through, like, as you spend time in that part of the country. And I think the module does a pretty good job of capturing that. I will say that I don't think it's the best as far as role-playing games go. I think that there's other role-playing game material that does a better job as far as creating this kind of fantasy Appalachia, but it's a pretty good one. Something that I think it does do really well, though, and this is something that many of the DCC adventures that I've played do really well, is big occult ritual set pieces. So if you think back to Sailors on the Starless Sea and that sort of finale where the characters are crossing a vast, inky, black underground ocean, making their way to this sort of, like, ziggurat where all these, like, crazy beastmen are doing things. Or if you think to the Croaking Fane, another one we've covered, and the moment where all of the frog cultists are sort of spawning and changing, in their sort of, like, spawning pool thing, that whole ritual aspect of it. These are big, epic feeling, dark, intense kind of set pieces, and DCC modules are great at this. And I think that this one has a pretty good set piece like that too. Here's some from the text. This large chamber stands beneath a 30-foot high ceiling held aloft by columns carved from the surrounding mountain rock. The middle of the open room holds a 20-foot diameter table crafted from black stone. A number of dull crystalline specks are set into the table's surface in seemingly random patterns. In each of the room's four walls stands an open archway leading into darkness beyond. A thick blanket of dust covers the table and floor of the room, and a horrendous odor fills the air here. You almost gag at the stench of rotting waste and decay. It's a powerful scene.
Yeah, it is, and that's not even that's the antechamber to the finale as well.
That's like the main one. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So, like, which was, by the way, was very well put together. I think it's quite hard to mechanically and sort of narratively speaking. It has one major big bad guy and his sidekick, hired henchman, who's a sort of disgusting, diseased mummy guy, and there are some other monsters around, and they all have a good gimmick each. And it also feels, although obviously I've only played it once, so this is an unscientific estimate, but it feels like it's well calibrated for that 5th level DCC. Like, you're probably not all going to get killed by this thing, but you're all going to burn through all your luck points and so on, and be broken and changed by the end of it, which
Right,
which is just what you need. It comes off really well. The pacing in that room that you read the description of is good as well, because you've just come from a medium-sized monster fight that will possibly kill one of your characters if, for example, he jumps off the bridge like an idiot, Tim. But and then so you need to catch your breath, and it lets you catch your breath by exploring that very atmospheric, like tiny. I mean, it's like what, 2 rooms from there to the end, but like it's just enough pause so that you're ready to go again on the big finale. So yeah, really, really good pacing, which is again a thing that DCC does well. Like Starless Sea has a similar thing. You know, the menacing cross across the lake, then the monster attack there. Spoilers for Starless Sea, by the way.
Yeah.
And then the grand finale on the other side. I really enjoyed that part of it.
I have a bunch of smaller things I like as well, but I'd be curious to kind of hear some of your bigger takeaways from this. What'd you like about it?
Overall, it was interesting to play this first and then come back and read it, because I looked at and then I reconsidered what I'd experienced doing the Chained Coffin, the adventure by itself. And I have to say, I think that as a climactic showdown, after a few adventures in the setting, once you've had time to get invested in the Shadow Mountains and care about whether or not they get destroyed and whether or not you're going to see that fur trader guy back in town who's always trying to sell you weird and unusual armor, then the premise and the format are great. Like, it's a ticking clock on it. There's a lot of uncertainty, because I don't know if you've seen the map of the Shadow Mountains. It's just all hills with trees on it. Like, you look at it and you think, this goes on forever. How are we going to find anything? It's actually fairly simple in terms of locations you can go to. But as a player, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like you're just setting out into random wilderness to get attacked by wolves. And it just feels like the wheel you're looking for could be anywhere. It's pretty desperate. It just worked out really well. And the NPCs are put together well as well. Like Old Black Cloak, the devil figure, he's very classic. He's your... Wait, what's the devil called in Faust? Not Beelzebub, he's... Mephistopheles. He's your Mephistophelian devil. Mm. And Granny Holder, yeah, I mean, borderline stereotypes aside, she's an appalling woman. Every time she appeared, I couldn't wait to get rid of her. I think we agreed to go and do her giant toenail quest purely so she would go away and stop eating at our table. And like, she's a classic, the disgusting witch trope, like, you know, the one that's inexplicably in Prince of Thieves, or I suppose Tracy Ullman in Men in Tights. That kind of like really just horrible potions and goop around them. Yeah, she was really good. And just, so the puzzle wheel, good gimmick, but also the Chained Coffin itself. What a great MacGuffin thing. Like, it doesn't really make much sense, but it's just really cool and metal. You got to lug this giant silver coffin. It's got chains around it. You can't open it. It talks to you sometimes when you're not doing the mission. And it's a real hassle, because it's a giant metal coffin that's lighter than it should be, but is still a real pain, and you have to guard it so it doesn't get stolen and stuff like that. It just all creates these very distinct images in your mind, which is great to focus on. When you have a generic fantasy adventure, it's easy to sort of forget what you were doing. But when you're walking around fantasy Smoky Mountains with a giant silver coffin in a cart, that keeps you focused on the job at hand. So yeah, I really enjoyed all the imagery, and then the very to-the-point format. It works really well. But with that caveat, I think you do have to already slightly care about the Shadow Mountains already. If it's a one-shot, I don't think you can do a save-the-world adventure that quickly. Like, you have to... Yeah, you know. Yeah. But yeah.
No, that makes sense. Yeah. I liked a lot of those things too. I'll also throw in that I thought that the song, the Lonely Mountain Hearts song that's sort of in the text, is quite good. I'm a sucker for songs and poems in adventure texts. Oh, I like the rumor table. I like that the rumor table is written in the first person and it's kind of in voice. That was kind of cool. And yeah, I also had a note here about like finding the coffin weirdly appealing as a sort of engine for the story. It's like you said, it's awkward. It just has a strangeness to it. They're just lugging this thing around. It occasionally talks. It's kind of helpful, at least. Kind of, yeah. Like it's sort of helpful. I mean, maybe it's more helpful in play than it seems like from the text.
No.
But also, Zugun in the coffin is keeping an eye on the party in order to Willy Wonka style, like, you know, invest one of them with some power. Overall, I really like the Chained Coffin. I'm curious to look at more of the Shutter Mountain setting because, in my opinion, it could have gone even further with the Fantasy Appalachia thing. I think there was a lot more it could have done, and I'm wondering if that's just in the rest of the material and not just in this adventure.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it might be. There's a lot of chapels and revival tents and mining and all that kind of...
Okay, good. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff I want to see. Yeah, that's good. That's good to hear. Cool. Well, let's go to things we had questions about. So, Tom, kick us off.
So my first and main question was, I guess the thing I just referenced, like, does this work without the build-up of several adventures in the Shudder Mountains? I think probably yes. What do you reckon from a look at it?
Maybe, kind of like what I just said, I don't think you get enough of the fantasy Appalachia in this one adventure. Not enough for me anyway. So if your goal is to telegraph that part, if that's an important goal you're aiming for, then maybe not. But on the other hand, that might make it a perfect one-shot because it can just be some vaguely Appalachia-like mountain setting.
Yeah, that's a good point, to be fair. Yeah. Structurally, of course, it would be fine. But although, having said that, that's my second question. Do you think the final confrontation could have a bit more going on? It's like you end up in a big, featureless, gently curved bowl location with one massive obelisk in it. Now, we did manage to brain the giant monster guy against the obelisk, but that's pretty much the only feature there. Would you, like, reset it somewhere, maybe, or what?
I don't know. I mean, on paper, it seemed okay to me, but how did it feel in play? Like, did it feel epic enough? Did it feel like a finale?
Oh, no, it felt pretty epic and desperate, with, like, a giant cleric shouting, "Burn more luck, you guys, I'm getting my ass kicked here." It did feel like there weren't that many options to do. It's like, oh, am I going to go and hide behind? Oh, no, that's right, I can't hide anywhere. There's nothing here. It's a featureless plane. Normally, I think for a good combat battle scene in D&D stroke OSR games, you want to have a bit more of an interactive landscape, even if it's just props to pick up and throw at people or multi-levels. This was it,
right?
Especially after the bridge, which is a very three-dimensional problem. There's sort of a flying monster that swoops under the arches and attacks you and stuff. It seemed a little literally flat. But as I said, the monsters were well designed, so that did make up for it. But I feel like, just stick a ruined Colosseum-style structure in there or something. Maybe that might help.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It seemed okay to me on the page, but I'd have to play it, I guess, to see. Okay, so maybe I'm missing it, but I can't figure out the thematic connections between Fantasy Appalachia and what the characters are meant to be doing in the adventure. The two DCC gods, the whole Dusan wheel thing, basically the whole second half of the adventure. I don't know what any of that has to do with an Appalachia-type setting. Like, the setting just comes off as color and flavor, and just barely that to me.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that the Shudder Mountains makes this feel a little bit more connected or something, but thematically it felt disconnected to me.
Well, no, that actually is what I meant with my last question. Does this ancient legend stuff, like, does it go together? It doesn't feel like it's sort of okay.
Yeah.
We know there are ancient things underneath the Shudder Mountains. That's quite often alluded to, but I don't know, man. I feel like it does feel like generic fantasy beings have dropped into the setting suddenly.
Right.
I think that's the thing I like the least about it. I know that there's a serpent folk underground thing going on in Shudder Mountains somewhere. I'd rather have fought a giant snake monster, maybe, that I admittedly would have just been a gloss on what we actually did, but it would have felt more like something that you would encounter.
There's like Christian connotations.
Yeah, snake handling and stuff.
It would have been a little bit more tied in, thematically, I think. Yeah, it does feel a little thematically disconnected. I wasn't 100% convinced, but like I said, I do think that I'd like to give the rest of the setting a look just to sort of confirm those thoughts. But that was my initial impression, at least, from reading this. Other question, is this another case of where the player characters are the bad guys, especially as it relates to the Bigantes? Because I feel like those hill giants were just minding their own business.
They absolutely are. And yeah. So
okay.
It's hard for me to judge that, though, because in our game, due to what can only be described as some of the flukiest dice rolls you've ever seen, we somehow befriended them, and they didn't try and kill and eat us, and they just gave us their toenails because we asked.
Yeah, okay.
So that was good. Fine. Yeah, I think you're right. That's a PCs being the bad guys thing. We tried our best to resist having to go there at all because we knew that we were being the bad guys. That was a little frustrating
right,
in a way. But
those hill giants were minding their own business. They had like nothing. Yeah.
It came off okay in the end, but through
that's good.
Sheer luck. Yeah.
Last question: how did the puzzle go? Because from my read of it, I don't understand how the players are supposed to solve it. How did they go to figure it out? And how did it go for you guys?
Yeah, we did. There are clues scattered along the way. I know this because one of our players was carefully drawing the symbols when they showed up.
Okay.
Although, like, just from description. So when we got to the wheel and we're like looking at the drawings and looking at the wheel, we're like, does that look like that? I guess so. Yes, it took us 2 attempts. because there's more than one kind of believable. So yeah, we all got struck by lightning one time, and then didn't want to do that again. So we made extra sure we were pretty certain about the second attempt.
Right. Yeah.
But to be honest with you, man, I'm not totally. I'll level with you. I was the one who got us electrocuted, so clearly I don't understand how you're supposed to solve the puzzle. But you can do it.
In case we didn't make it super clear, listeners, Tom mentioned it kind of at the top, but it's a physical puzzle that you pass out to the table, and it's made of 3 concentric circles that all have symbols around it, and you're supposed to just like align these 3 symbols, and if you do it wrong, then you get zapped by lightning. Tom, you're saying that like there are clues to the solution in the adventure. I must have missed it. I didn't really pick up on it. Maybe I wasn't paying attention, but I looked at that puzzle and I was like, I don't get it. Like, I don't know. And I don't know how I would get it if I was playing this.
Difficult.
I don't know what I would do.
I'm trying to remember what it is. It's something to do with they're all like elemental symbols, I think.
It's
something
like
I don't know, man.
Fire, earth, water, or something you have to line up. Yeah,
and then,
something like that.
And it takes on an extra air of desperation, by the way, if you're playing online. So the GM is holding up the thing to the camera, and you're all shouting, no, left, stop, wait. And then he sort of holds it and goes, is that your final answer? And we all go, yeah, no. Yeah, good times. So it is a fun. I called it a gimmick twice, I think, or 3 times now. But it is one. But it's a good one. We did enjoy that part of the proceedings. So it's good that we didn't find the back door in a way.
Awesome. Let's go to the chain lightning round. I like this description of the Shudfolk. A PC who minds his manners, compliments a farmer on his crops, praises a cook's food, offers to chop wood for the supper fire, or contributes a bit of food to a shared meal will be treated like extended family by the Shudfolk, although I will note here that the very next sentence talks about how this is a place that is a sundown town, which of course has some unsavory historical connotations. But I'll skip that part for now.
Okay. The tomb where you find the Chained Coffin contains 2 skeletal guardians, and one of them is a gigantic human-serpent hybrid. Now, the ox-headed skeleton is fine as monsters go, but the human-serpent one, and its picture that is in handout A, kind of freaked me out. It's really good.
I like this description of Granny Hulda's place. A crude cabin of rough-hewn logs stands in a small hillside clearing, its wooden sides and split-shingled roof covered with patches of pale green moss. The structure rests atop several 5-foot-high posts, making it proof against dangerous wildlife. A small garden grows beside the cabin. Numerous animal skulls, bleached by the sun and weather-worn, dangle from nearby tree branches or stand impaled on tall stakes around the cabin.
The Bad Lick Beast is an awful combination of man, goat, and moth. Now, this monster was the enemy in a terrific fight-runaway scene featuring a foolhardy Swedish fighter, and, best of all, is well foreshadowed early in the scenario, thus: the sounds of the night suddenly silence as the crickets halt their chorus and a screech owl's cry abruptly quiets. A moment later, a gust of wind blows past you, shaking the pines and rustling the mountain grass like a gale storm. Above the wail of the wind, you faintly hear the sound of great wings beating in the night sky, and the GM is advised to repeat this menacing encounter several times.
One of the Chaos Champion's minions is Malucias, who is described thusly. Malucias is an obese human male who keeps his corpulent body wrapped in leper's bandages to obscure the mystical diseases and corruption that rack his body. Charming.
The demon, or Black Cloak, lets Zugun in the Chained Coffin try to talk you out of dealing with him, and then says, "Oh, you all have a very noisy coffin there, but are you truly going to listen to the dead man in the box? Seems to me a man in that predicament isn't the wisest of folks, and shouldn't be giving advice to fine, breathing people like yourselves."
Not an unreasonable observation.
I mean, yeah.
Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. Tom, I have looked at all your notes. I'm not sure I understand the topic.
Excellent.
So I am learning at your knee, just like the listeners are. I will do my best to keep up. So what are we talking about today?
We're talking about intertextuality. Don't worry, it's actually pretty simple. So intertextuality just means where one text, we'll call it that, like if you're talking about books, has its meaning shaped or changed by another one. So the example that's in the Chained Coffin, and that sort of made me think about this for the expert delve, is when you find the grave of the legendary fiddler, which is near the crossroads, I think, And in his grave is a golden fiddle you can pick up, and it's you can use it as an enchanted item against the forces of evil if you play it. Of course, if you've heard the song The Devil Went Down to Georgia by the Charlie Daniels Band, which is basically the theme tune for the Shadow Mountain setting, right. You instantly, you know what's up with this. But at the time when it happened, I think, I'm trying to remember, did all of us know what it was referring to? Maybe one didn't, or I at least thought, well, what if you didn't recognise what it's supposed to be? Would that matter too much? And I think the answer is no, because it's a golden fiddle, and then a voice says, hey, you should pick up the golden fiddle. So it's like, although you would be more suspicious, I think, if you hadn't heard the song, because you wouldn't know it was a thing that belonged to a good guy who beat the devil. Spoilers for a country song, by the way. But rather, you might think, oh, it's a trick. And so that's an example of how knowing about one text, the song, changes your understanding of the other, the game that we're playing.
Okay, I'm with you.
And that's actually, one of the classic elevator pitches for role-playing games. And there was one game, I forget which, that had this literally in the what is a role-playing game section, is, have you ever watched a movie or read a novel and thought, well, that's not what I'd do? Well, in a role-playing game, you can prove it. Like you get to... you're reacting to that text thinking, oh, that's not a good idea. So yeah, especially in a very established genre, like generic fantasy or a licensed game, you immediately are engaging in intertextuality because you're reacting through the way you're playing to other existing media. And then there's also metatextuality, which is where one thing like deliberately makes critical comments about another, which also has a lot of precedent in role-playing games. One relatively recent example is Cthulhu Dark, which says, hey, what if we had Lovecraftian adventures, but the heroes aren't all waspy rich guys?
Right, yeah.
And the effects that has on the game are quite profound. So I had a couple of things in my back catalogue that I thought we could talk about, and I was sort of thinking about them, what I had learned about intertextuality and the effect it has in your game and what you can use it for on purpose.
Okay, great.
So one of those is the infamous DCC Celebrity Big Brother Dungeon Crawl, which is how I ran Sailors on the Starless Sea. And the other is World of Blades Verona, which I don't think we've really talked about on here, but I ran for
you have a little bit.
a while. It ran for a few months, a few years back. The first of those is the easy one, right? It's a jokey game. It's a reality show featuring B-list, at best, celebrities going through a DCC funnel and dying a lot. It's like intertextuality on easy mode. So one of the things it's good for is getting the tone and format across. Like, you immediately, you say, oh, it's a reality show, but the contestants are in a deadly fantasy dungeon. It's that we do this a lot for role-playing games, Jason Bourne versus vampires, pirates, but in space, that kind of thing. And then in the game, it does interesting things, or we found it did interesting things that I hadn't really thought about. I just thought it would be funny to see what happened if you put Anthea Turner, that's a reference no one outside Europe will get, but like if you put these sort of daytime TV celebs through a dungeon, I just thought it would be amusing. But what actually happened was that you sort of find yourself exploring what you think about reality TV and sort of what you think about these celebrities, even though you don't know them. And also like the way that D&D style games work and intra-party conflict, because the similarity between Jedward shouting at some old newsreader about who did the washing up in the Big Brother house is surprisingly similar to whether or not you should use the healing potion right now. And so so that was like pretty straightforward. Like parody is just, it's just intertextual comedy. And then the Verona game was approximately as ridiculous a confection as the Big Brother one, like definitely equally obvious in how it was connected to text. It was but it was a lot darker and bloodier and more serious when you actually started playing. So it was an urban fantasy. It was World of Dungeons, but with Blades in the Dark playbooks, basically. Set in the Verona of Romeo and Juliet. Sadly, not the Verona Beach of Romeo plus Juliet, but one day I will run that game. So that's already an adaptation of a string of novellas and poems itself. And then the game we ran, it included adventures from Warhammer and Nightmares Underneath. It was that sort of thing. But also it had another strand of deliberately referring to real-world art in a way that kind of foregrounded how this wasn't a real self-standing setting, which was that in the game you could, once you knew how to, step into a painting, walk around inside it, including the parts not visible to the viewer, and you could travel to another painting by the same artist and step outside of it, like wherever it was in the world. And those paintings were not confined to ones that already existed by 16 whenever it was set.
Yeah.
So as we played, we were able to mess around with lots of ideas of dramatic archetypes, specifically Shakespearean ones, but generally there were lots of themes of connections between art. The whole thing had been sparked by me noticing that one of the Blades in the Dark playbooks was an exact copy of the thief class in World of Dungeons. Also, one thing we notice is counterintuitively, when you're sort of thinking about historical accuracy, having a historical character show up immediately relieves you of that burden. Like when you're watching a movie that's about a real person, as soon as you realise it, like Russell Crowe is not a mathematician, Patrick Stewart is not actually King Richard, you don't need to worry about getting things wrong or right. I mean, you do a bit, but it takes the pressure off in a way that I didn't expect. Those are sort of two very explicitly intertextual on purpose games that I've been in. And then the Chained Coffin does it a lot. I mean, as you said, right, it's steeped in the folklore of, well, Americana, folklore, but interestingly in ways that I'm probably not really aware of, but you are. Like, you picked out some of the cryptids, I think.
It's such a moving target. It's funny because we're talking about intertextuality, but there is no real text as far as American folklore goes.
Yeah.
It's more of just a sort of ambient thing that you just learn as an American by being an American. And, maybe in school you might read about Aesop's fables or Paul Bunyan type stories or whatever. And you might hear about the Jersey Devil and various other cryptids and things like that. But I wouldn't say there's like a text. I mean, I think the term still obviously applies. And your specific example of The Devil Went Down to Georgia makes a lot of sense. This intertextuality discussion is part of what made The Chained Coffin a little unsatisfying for me just from a read, because it embraced some of those like American folklore aspects of its setting until it definitely didn't.
Yeah.
Like it just like drops them at a certain point. And I feel like there was a missed opportunity there where they could have like made the ritual, the gods, all of that like a little more connected to the setting itself. And so it felt like a missed opportunity to me. And I think the ways in which The Chained Coffin like embraces intertextuality, but then like just kind of abandons it at times, makes it, it's not bad, but it just was a little unsatisfying as far as that goes. Like, I think there were some opportunities there that it could have really leaned into, thematically speaking, especially. As you're talking about intertextuality, that's what's coming to my mind right now. Like, that's what I'm thinking about from my read of The Chained Coffin.
Yeah, and you're mentioning that has just reminded me of Zidek Hsu's Hantu book, which we discussed very briefly when talking about Thousand Islands.
Right, yeah.
None of the monsters in that are real, but they will deliberately recall genuine traits that Hantu in Malaysia have. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think if that sort of final boss monster and indeed the inciting incident in the Chained Coffin had more Americana traits in it,
yeah, it would have been a lot better, wouldn't it?
Would have been a bit better, yeah. So
I think the Badlick, what's it called, the Badlick beast or whatever
the
creature was, that was probably the closest that it got to feeling very Americana. That was to me, that was the cryptid idea. That was the urban legend idea. That's sort of vibe that the module is attempting for the first part of it, at least, because it's something that like people talk about. It's something that it's located in kind of like a specific hollow. The way it's described, that a lot of times like American cryptids are like just mishmashes of other things, like all into one big.
Yeah, the Badlick Beast is monster, explicitly right? Called out as three things smooshed together, isn't it? Yeah,
right. Yeah. So it kind of it definitely
like a jackalope.
It felt the most like, okay, we've kind of, this is what we're doing here, right? This is an American folklore kind of thing, even though that was a totally made up creature. I'm pretty sure that's not like a real thing from American folklore. It might be.
It doesn't seem like. I mean, I feel like I would have heard of that thing.
Yeah. But even like the way it was named, though, the Badlick Beast, right? Or the way that the devil was named, like Old Black Cloak, that recalls a sort of this American folklore idea. I can't remember what some of the nicknames of the devil are, but it's something
Old
like
Scratch
that, right?
Is the one in
Old Scratch,
right, Daniel Webster, right?
Yeah. And then it just like discards all that completely when it gets to the sort of like more DCC type stuff. And I don't think they went far enough.
Yeah,
as far as that goes, I think they could have really leaned into it with this adventure.
Okay.
So I guess my question, as far as like, talking about intertextuality, I'm curious, what's the practical takeaway here? I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm all about like practical applications.
Indeed, because the issue here is the listener presumably is thinking, we do that all the time. That's how role-playing games work.
That's how role-playing games go, right?
That's kind of it, yeah. And that's the thing. So the sort of practical method you can think about is there are three categories that critics or academics talk about of this. The first is obligatory, which is like you have to know the source text to really understand what you're doing now. So the example here would be like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. If you don't know anything about Hamlet, that play, I mean, there's some good gags in it, but you're not really going to get a lot out of it.
It's not gonna come off, yeah.
Although, I mean, that was one of the fun things about the Verona game, is like we engaged almost not at all with the Montagues and Capulets, but the fact that one of the mission givers was Lord Montague and like Friar Lawrence was over there, that was... But yeah, so like if you don't know about the Golden Fiddle, then you can't do anything. And so that's what's called obligatory. Then there's optional, where it's possible to find intertextual references, which changes your understanding, but it's not essential. And then there's accidental, which is where the author doesn't even intend to create an intertextual link, but the reader or player's own knowledge makes that link. And I'd say in role-playing games, I think we want to aim for that middle road, right, where it's optional. You know, like I complain about D&D adventures where I'm required to know that a green dragon versus a red dragon is like mechanically some difference that interests me, not one iota, right? But then for someone who does know that, it's still valuable information.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I've been very focused on my game Brindlewood Bay lately because it's the only game of my own I've ever published, and I'm kind of deep in working on it in different ways right now. Brindlewood Bay, which is a game that combines cozy murder mysteries with Lovecraftian horror. It's Murder, She Wrote meets The Shadow over Innsmouth. It's great. Brindlewood Bay, the text makes quite a lot of references to American TV shows, to murder mystery shows, to things that feature older women, like the way that you describe your maven and all that kind of stuff.
To Alf.
And Alf, yeah, and Alf as well. It makes all these references, and you're right. Like, every now and then when I run the game, someone is like, I don't know what it means for my character's style to be Alexis Carrington Colby, or to be, I don't know what it means for her style to be Up in Pumps or whatever, right? And I'm always like, it's okay. You don't have to know what it means. Like, I can give you the basics, but just, Google it or just pick something else, or it doesn't really matter. Like, you don't need to know these things to play the game. And so I think I'm in the optional space, I hope, because I think like the game is better if you understand the references, but it's still very enjoyable without them. So I think I'm somewhere in the middle of...
Yeah. And that's the thing, sometimes you're gonna have obligatory ones.
Yeah.
Like if you're playing a Star Wars game, you kind of have to understand that spaceships can travel between star systems. At some point that's going to come up, and if someone didn't already know it, then you should probably tell them.
Yeah.
But I mean, more dangerous in some ways is the accidental, because actually accidental, in fact, is what the magic of the role-playing game is all about, because one incident is different for everyone at the table. Like when you describe something as being really large, they'll, like, the size of a whale, some of them will have seen a whale in real life and like be picturing that, and some of them will just be like thinking of, I don't know, a painting of one they saw once. But of course it has some problems, like, for example, if you make a mistake. So like you're trying to convey that someone's from Madagascar, but for some reason you describe the flag of Japan. Now, everyone who recognises that flag is going, oh, well, it's Japanese, I guess, right? Yeah, Japanese. And be reacting completely in the quote-unquote wrong way. I was once in a Delta Green game where it gradually became apparent that the GM believed that the CIA is like this government agency that all other agencies in America report to. And like, if you're doing some kind of outre Camp 60 spy game, that would probably be okay. Like, it would be just a little bit crazy. But that's not really the thing we had signed up for or was being presented to us. So we were like kind of trying to drop in these hints, and eventually we just said, you do know that's not what the CIA does, right? But he wasn't having it. It kind of ruined the game. So that's what I'm talking about. Like, just... I mean, Google things before you throw them into a scenario, or before you like decide your character is X or Y or has a certain name. Think about what the different meanings might be, how your cultural context might be different from other people's. You can't describe things entirely by comparing them to anime series that people haven't watched. Actually, I think it's the same guy who ran that Delta Green game used to be told, we haven't seen that anime, and then continue to describe things by comparing them to that anime. So that's the deal with, both accidental and obligatories. You have to think about what you know and how it's different from what other people know.
It's definitely a line to straddle, because when earlier you said, like, we use this, it's Jason Bourne but with vampires, it's pirates but in space. We use these like easy references to help bridge everyone's understanding, which is a really critically important part of role-playing games. And creating like a basic shared understanding, a shared headspace, is sometimes the easiest thing to do, but also can be quite tricky depending on what you're dealing with. At the very least, you probably need to make sure that like all your ducks are in a row if you're facilitating the game, as far as like, are people going to understand this? In my game, I know there are things that the reader and the players are not going to understand, and I tried to make it to where it doesn't matter. Like, you can still play through it and still get the experience that the game is designed for. But it's definitely something that you have to be mindful of, I think. And I think going back to our favorite topic, I think this is where theme is really helpful, because theme can help create a consistent through line when we do have sort of like accidental misunderstandings about like what something is about, right? You know, like maybe we all have like kind of a slightly different idea about something, but the theme can help tie it all together. I think that's kind of why the Chained Coffin was a little jarring for me, because thematically it does feel so, there's such a hard break in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But with that said, though, you know, no, this is super interesting. Anything else you want to say about this?
No, I think we've covered it. Although I feel like we keep being mean to the Chained Coffin again, and I really enjoyed it.
It's really good.
It
was great
at the end. Yeah.
I didn't play it obviously, but no, it's great from a read. But you know, we have our particular enthusiasms here on Fear of the Black Dragon, and thematic consistency is one of them. Yeah, that was always going to be a thing, I think. Let's go to the companion adventures. Companion adventures. I have a lot. I'm going to start with books. I don't know much about Appalachia-specific folklore and folk magic. It's not not something I've studied particularly closely, but I do have done a lot of reading in this area in other geographical and cultural things that I'm more familiar with. And so I want to talk about a couple of things related to both hoodoo as practiced by mostly Black folks in Houston and that part of Texas and Louisiana, and then also the sort of folk healing traditions of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, which I'm much more personally familiar with because of some connections in my family. And so the first book I would recommend is called Working Conjure, A Guide to Hoodoo Folk Magic by Hoodoo Sen Moise. It was written in 2018, or published in 2018, and I actually just read this like 2 weeks ago. I finished it, and it's great. It presents itself as a sort of like practical guide to practicing hoodoo, making like little conjure bags and like, you know, doing, you know, working with plants and things like that. But underneath all that, there's this really like great education in sort of the way that hoodoo blends sort of like Christian traditions with traditions that come from other parts of the world, like Africa and the Caribbean. And so a really, really nice book. It's a quick read. Also, I'm going to recommend Curandero, A Life in Mexican Folk Healing by Cheo Torres. It's from 2005, and Cheo Torres is I don't know if he is anymore, but he's a professor in the University of Texas system. And basically, it's a book about curanderismo, which is like a Mexican folk healing tradition. It's very good. It's a nice, like, reasonably comprehensive survey of like the history and the practice of this folk healing tradition. I have a lot of connections to it personally because my family, or part of my family at least, has a curandera that we've been friends with and consulted with for many, many years. So it's an interesting insight into this particular regional type of folk magic and folk healing, and I think it's worth looking at. Again, a very fast read. And then the next thing I want to recommend is a magazine article from Texas Monthly Magazine, June 1977, called The Power.
I'll just pop out and get that.
No, we'll put a link in the show notes so you can totally read it online. It's called The Power, and this is one of my favorite pieces of writing, period. I love this article so much because what it is it's this author, a white man from Austin, who is going into these Black and brown spaces to learn about hoodoo, about Mexican American and Mexican folk healing, about various voodoo practices. Like, he visits different cities in Texas and inserts himself into these environments. And so it's interesting because there's this weird tension in the article, because basically the author, whose name escapes me, John Davidson maybe, he is clearly skeptical, and I would even say his tone is slightly sneering, but he somehow, whether intentionally or not, somehow manages to paint this very vivid and perhaps accidentally so affectionate view of a particular place and time. Something that people who've lived in Houston for a long time or spent any time in Houston know, but maybe people outside of Houston don't really know, is that there is vanishing, but historically there is a connection to magical and, you know, folk healing arts, particularly as practiced by Black folks. And that's something that is kind of sadly disappearing. But back in the 70s, at least, it was a very identifiable thing. One of the most famous, and I think the last of the hoodoo shops in the entire North America is in Houston, Stanley Pharmacy. And so, long story short, too late. The article just does such a great job of painting this really interesting, vivid picture of different cities in Texas and the different folk traditions and folk magic and folk healing traditions, and is kind of a time capsule. Sorry, that was a lot. But it's a favorite subject of mine, listeners. So, why don't you do something, Tom?
Sure. Well, I have a couple of music recommendations for the region. One is the music of Ralph Stanley and his oft-times backing band, the Clinch Mountain Boys, who are kind of old-time or bluegrass group who were knocking around for ages. And then also the Fairfield Four, a group founded astonishingly in 1921, but somehow still going, presumably not the original members, sometimes performing as the Fairfield Five. And they're, so that's just sort of, the Clinch Mountain Boys, as you might imagine, are very white, and the Fairfield Four are black gospel and a cappella music. And obviously there's always been crossover in Appalachian folk music, and including indigenous music as well to a degree. But it's by the time you get to recorded music, around the 1920s, it's not exactly an integrated scene. So you tend to have these two sides to things, but they're both very much part of the folk music traditions of the eastern United States. And Ralph Stanley actually is on the soundtrack of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? A film that I borderline recommend for this, because it's in the wrong place and it's kind of the wrong tone, but it has a lot of the Shadow Mountain-y elements, like the sirens at the river. That's a thing that happened in one of our Shadow Mountain adventures. Although those sirens turned out to be giant catfish that were planning to eat us, which I think might be an internet joke. But yeah, certainly the music of era and genre is what you expect. It is a good movie. I just don't think it fits this sketch very well. Yeah. And I've got a couple of quick film things. There's Django from 1966, a spaghetti western that I'm recommending solely because of the beginning bit where Django drags a coffin into town, which is clearly the inspiration for this scenario.
Yeah, that's good.
And very much not a recommendation. I'd just like to mention that multi-Razzie nominated Steven Seagal vehicle Fire Down Below is set in rural eastern Kentucky, and that's the beginning of what I like to think of as his weird environmentalist phase before his current weird blues albums and Russian citizenship phase.
Right, yeah, that's good. My last two recommendations leave Texas and Mexico and go back to Appalachia. I'm going to recommend the podcast Dolly Parton's America. This was my absolute favorite podcast series from last year. It is put together by Jad Abumrad, who does Radiolab, which is a very well-regarded show. And basically, Jad Abumrad, his father was Dolly Parton's doctor for a number of years. And so he's like family friends with Dolly Parton. And so, or at least his dad is. This was his way of getting a long sit-down interview with Dolly Parton. And that's something she doesn't do very often. And at least like this very frank and open and kind of way. And because she's a very self-styled, self-controlled sort of businesswoman, right? She presents a certain, vision of herself. But in Dolly Parton's America, we get like a little bit more vulnerability. And more importantly, the show has a deep affection and love for the Great Smoky Mountains. And the music and culture of the region is just portrayed really beautifully. It's such a wonderful balm in American pop culture, which is otherwise quite unkind to this part of the country. And so I really recommend it. It was a great series. I cried multiple times. Like, it's so good. And the last thing I'm going to recommend is Southern Holler. This is a game thing. Southern Holler by Linda Codega. It is a Trophy Dark incursion. It was, in fact, the winner of the contest that we held last year. It is phenomenal. It takes place in a more directly Appalachia kind of setting, which is to say that, like, we're meant to believe it's, like, actually in a sort of mid-century Appalachia as opposed to a sort of fantasy veneer of it. But it is so beautifully written. It is well-researched. It just captures this it captures this sort of poetry of the land. It just expresses so many wonderful ideas and really gets you in the mood to want to explore a setting like that. And I can't recommend it more highly. I believe it's available on itch.io. We'll try to get you a link in the show notes. I think it's all got though.
Cool.
So Listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find us on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. If you'd like to support this show with a little bit of money, which we love and appreciate, that can be done on patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you, our astonishing editor, Rich Rogers. Goodbye.
Take care. Hi listeners, Jason from Gauntlet Publishing here. I want to tell you about a couple of new things we have for you this month. The first is Nephews and Peril, a major expansion for Brindlewood Bay, the game of cozy murder mysteries and supernatural horror. Nephews and Peril is a collection of 6 new mysteries for the game, each by a different fabulous author, and some revised rules and gameplay advice. It can be found in the $6 plus Gauntlet Patreon feed until October 15th, and then Drive-Thru RPG after that. The next thing I want to tell you about is Codex Home, the first issue in Volume 5 of the magazine. Codex Home features new material for Trophy Gold in Brindlewood Bay, plus the all-new game Back Again from the Broken Land, which is about fantasy heroes recounting stories as they return home from a calamitous war against a Dark Lord, all while evading the remnants of that Dark Lord's army. It's a fantastic Powered by the Apocalypse game, and we're delighted to share it with you later in October. Remember, your contributions to the Gauntlet Patreon help support everything we do in the community, including this very podcast. As always, thanks so much for your support.